Thank you for joining our webinar, Building an Unrivaled Brand Protection Strategy. My name is Akino Chikada, Portfolio Marketing Director for MarkMonitor, and I'm excited to be joined by my colleague, David Cooper, who's the Vice President at MarkMonitor. David is a recognized thought leader in the brand protection space and has led MarkMonitor sales and business development efforts for more than a decade. His tenure and experience with MarkMonitor include helping to shape, launch, and develop online brand protection programs for hundreds of the most prolific brands globally. Previously, David has held various key strategic positions for MarkMonitor, from launching new product lines to running our Latin American sales organization. Today, David is going to share some interesting insights about how brand owners can build an effective, meaningful brand protection strategy. Dave, over to you.
Great, thanks Akino. Appreciate the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to be here today with all of you. As Akino mentioned, I've been with MarkMonitor for almost 16 years, and so I was excited at the opportunity to be able to present just some thoughts around really what we believe matters when you're building an effective online brand protection strategy. And you know, whether you're building that program internally using your own people and various tools, or you're using an external vendor, a combination of outside counsel and vendors, whatever your sort of preferred method is, we think that there are some good best practices to keep in mind, because the landscape is ever evolving, you know, as I'm sure you all are aware. So just jumping into it, there were some questions that obviously we feel are important to ask when you're designing a program or assessing a program that is already up and running. And, you know, it really starts with having defined goals. And one of the things that we've seen and experienced just doing, you know, sort of thousands of engagements over a 15 to 18-year period is it's really important to have defined achievable goals and understand where your starting point is. Then I think probably equally as important is having a clear way of measuring the effectiveness of the program and a defined approach and language in the way that you speak about it internally, we have found is incredibly important when trying to really educate the rest of the business about why is this program important? What are we trying to achieve, and how effective are we at achieving it? I think at a more tactical level, making decisions about platforms and areas to cover is fairly critical and important. And I think for most brands that we've worked with over the years, majority of them, I think, have discovered that there's a multitude of places. And so having a strategy for understanding which platforms matter the most and then prioritizing those is something we'll certainly touch on. And then in terms of measuring effectiveness and really justifying budget and expenditure, there's a multitude of different strategies that we know brands and vendors use in the space. And so we'll discuss some of those and actually hone in on one strategy in particular, which we think has sort of manifested itself over the last 2 or 3 years and is worth acknowledging and pointing out. Just from a really high level, for anyone who's at least not aware, MarkMonitor is part of a larger company called Clarivate, and Clarivate Analytics has 5 separate companies within it, MarkMonitor being really the flagship brand. But as a company and a provider in the space, we've been around since 1999, and we really focus on 2 primary areas: corporate domain management and online brand protection, monitoring outside your firewall for various problems that we can detect and remediate. Most brands today are experiencing abuse in a multitude of different areas. And so really thinking about your brand protection approach and strategy holistically is, I think, not only important, but sort of required. because these issues are overlapping. There is very few instances of counterfeiting that don't also include the usage of your IP. There are a multitude of compliance-related issues that are detected, even if you're focused on some other different type of online abuse. And so approaching it holistically, we think, is frankly the only way to go. And so when you think about your program and its capabilities, we think you should certainly make note of that and try to develop a solution with partners and technology that gives you the broadest perspective possible, not necessarily the deepest perspective, because there is a distinction there, and we'll touch on that in a moment as well. We've obviously done a lot in the space, and so we've learned a lot of lessons, doing almost 24 million marketplace takedowns around the world and focusing on huge amounts of websites and social media content and, processing all of this information and attempting to defend almost 2,000 brand owners in the space has allowed us, I think, the unique capability of getting a great perspective on what's worked and what doesn't work. And again, just from our own perspective, what we might suggest people want to focus on. And again, I think the things that we'll talk about here today don't necessarily apply to technology vendors like MarkMonitor only. I mean, I absolutely think brands can build programs in a multitude of different ways. And irrespective of the approach, there's a number of elements that we really do think are important. A big one is sort of a byproduct of the industry trying to understand the best way to measure success. And what we've discovered is that the quantity of enforcements in almost all cases does not necessarily equal the effectiveness and the result that you want. And this is primarily because there is such a large quantity of data that is out there that theoretically should be actioned for most brands, that the ability to focus and understand which content matters most is very difficult to achieve, or at least historically has been very difficult to achieve. And so I think the tendency has been to measure programs based on the quantity of enforcements. I removed X amount of listings, or this many websites, or this much content. And again, I think what we've discovered working with really big brands, some over a decade or longer, is that the quantity of enforcements that we initiate doesn't necessarily equal a better experience for the consumer. And that's really what brands want. And I think that's really what the mission is about, is protecting your customer from having a bad experience and protecting the company from losing revenue. And so certainly we think we should think through that lens when we're talking about measuring our program. We certainly see that, the types of abuse that we typically are after is not inadvertent abuse. In most cases, it's more sophisticated individuals and actors, I think, that in a lot of cases do what they do consciously. And so we see the move across digital channels as we ramp up our efforts. I think if your brand protection program is working, that should be a phenomenon that you see happening. Just as a practical example, moving counterfeit sellers from one platform to another, and then possibly even to another digital channel, from marketplaces to social media, for instance. So having the ability to monitor multiple areas or react and continue to apply that pressure is important, because the problem is sort of analogous to a balloon. And when we push on one side of that balloon, the other side begins to rise. So we really do need a fairly broad perspective in understanding where the problem is migrating. This next point, I think, is really sort of tied to the initial one, which is the level of intelligence available historically has been minimal in terms of truly understanding the problem and how it impacts well-intentioned consumers. And so putting more resources towards it won't necessarily equal more takedown success. And there's a difference between searching broadly, meaning I want to understand what's happening in marketplace platforms and social media concurrently, versus really looking deeper, because it is like a rabbit hole that has no bottom. And so what the important thing, again, that we've sort of discovered is that if we understand where consumers are going, I mean, really understand where they're interacting with our brands, we can focus our efforts on those areas and really maximize the impact. And that doesn't necessarily mean we need more resources to do that. It means we need to focus them in the right place. And then lastly, to sort of summarize some of those things, it's really about, you know, seeing the problem through the eyes of your customer. And when a customer goes out to any of those platforms, again, a marketplace or a social media platform, or does a mobile search on their phone for content through Google, what do they see? That should really be the starting point, we believe, for an effective brand protection strategy. So we've done a lot of research over the years, and obviously almost all of it published publicly at some point, or will be, but we also have a forum we do every October, and another event, the forums in San Francisco, and then we do a large New York event. And a big part of these events and these studies is, again, trying to understand the landscape in a granular way. And so when we, several years ago, started shifting towards the consumer-centric approach to this, it really became about understanding those customers and how they were interacting with brands online. And so we commission studies on an annual basis to sort of look at those topics and understand them. And there were some obvious sort of things that just jump out at us. You know, 4 out of 5 of the consumers that we talked to looked for authentic goods online. And, you know, over 85% of consumers believed that brands were really responsible for keeping them safe. So these are things I think that we all understand and believe, but we really wanted to go out and validate it. And then the other piece we looked at is their behavior online. And something that jumped out at me personally was that 85% of marketplace traffic never looks past the first 5 pages. And so if I go back to my original point about volume really being the metric that people, I think, look at, the challenge there is if the majority of your takedowns are happening, you know, on page 50 of an Amazon search result, the numbers will look large, but the impact on the well-intentioned consumer would be almost non-existent because they aren't on page 50. They're on the first 5 pages. They're probably only on page 1. So it's about focusing our resources on the right areas. 1 out of 5 users who accidentally end up on websites selling fake goods will actually move forward with their transaction. And that, again, jumped out at me as I thought a fairly large percentage of people. And so it is glaring, and I think sort of underscores the importance of purging the areas where those consumers live and shop and interact with us of as many of these bad sites and bad areas as possible. So we came to the ultimate conclusion that focusing on well-intentioned consumers is what matters most. They're looking for you. They want your authentic products or the authentic experience. We also discovered that prioritizing your enforcements and really targeting the most visible infringements just made practical sense to us. If consumers are not shifting into those other deeper areas of these platforms, then why would we have a significant amount of our resources focused there? But we do recognize that scale matters, not because I necessarily want to go deeper or think I should, but because I want to go broader. Being broad continues to be important. And the well-intentioned consumer in our minds is looking for authentic products and experiences, is willing to pay usually a premium for those things. And so they have expectations of your brand that will protect them, that we're looking out for them, that experience will be a good one. So if I'm building my own program, how can I protect this consumer? And we'll go through some of those techniques together. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think whether you're evaluating technology vendors or you're working to build a team internally to do a lot of this manually or with assistance from outside counsel, whatever your chosen strategy is, we think these are elements that are important and we should call them out and keep them in mind, because the consumer is absolutely the goal here and will result in a successful program. So the first thing is localized search within countries. So if I'm global or even regionally, content from major search engines, which is the primary way, or even other platforms, alternative platforms like Facebook, are serving up content locally, which means they have a very good understanding of the people and consumers and individuals that are on their platforms and where they are. And so they serve up that content based on those locations. So our ability to go out and look at the internet needs to emulate that. Otherwise, we're not going to have what we call organic one-to-one search experience, right? If I'm a consumer in Japan or Mexico or Germany or the United States for that matter, on any platform I go to, if I type in your brand, it's almost guaranteed that that platform is using some sort of localization. Then, if I want to find the abuse that's impacting these important, well-intentioned consumers, then I really need to understand keyword usage and local search habits. How do people find me in these markets? Because that's my starting point. That's the avenue to success that I need to protect. And so when someone goes to Amazon and types in my brand or to Google, what sort of keywords are they using? How are they finding us? Once you've sort of zeroed in, I think, on the platforms that you feel matter most to the business, understanding how those platforms are serving up the content is also important. Again, to ensure that we're at the intersection of your customer and the product experience and the brand experience, I need to understand how that content's being served up, whether that's a search engine or a marketplace platform. When I go out and I look, our technology that we use should be able to emulate that experience. And typically that's done using local IP addresses, what we refer to as virtual machines or proxies. I'll talk a little bit more about that and at least how MarkMonitor has leveraged it. But this is not unique technology that we've created. Understanding how more advanced capabilities may benefit you. Depending on the size and scope of your problem, one of the biggest impediments to success is the quantity of content that needs to get reviewed when you have an online program like this. And so, if you're a global brand really at the top tier of the Fortune 500, the quantity of data out there will be astronomical. And so any additional technology that can be brought to the table that it enables sort of machine learning or threat level analysis, which we'll talk about. These are all technologies that can be leveraged to speed the process of identifying unauthorized, suspicious, infringing content, and then having a human validate it for enforcement. I have yet to meet a brand in my 16 years here that's comfortable allowing machines to make enforcement decisions and takedown decisions. So the need for a human that's educated on the topic to review that content will probably never go away. So we need tools to help us speed that process up. And then really understanding, again, how to prioritize and isolate the content that consumers actually see. All infringing content is a problem on some level, especially if it's social engineering related, malware, phishing, and then, of course, topics like counterfeit products, depending on the type of issue that it is. We work with some brands that have a zero tolerance policy simply because there's consumer safety at risk. So we have to prioritize both the sort of risk mitigation strategy or the level of a risk, and also our ability to cover all of the actual areas where consumers may interact with the brand in that way. And then lastly, and again, I think this is a slightly sort of more advanced approach. Typically when we work with brands, we spend the first year kind of getting our arms around the issue and wrestling it to the ground, so to speak. And then we typically move on to programs like high-value targeting. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But inevitably what we're doing is we're treating the symptom of a larger problem, which is on the internet. But the internet is not the problem. Usually it manifests itself offline as well in some way, shape, or form. And so there is a desire, we know, amongst brands to get to the source of the problem. So this is an example of localized search and why it matters. And actually, I created the example by simply sitting in my office in San Francisco, and I went out to Taobao, and I typed in Adidas hat. And then I went and I replicated the same scan within the MarkMonitor system, same platform, same keyword search, but we were using localization within the platform. And I got 19 results. And so clearly there was a difference in the quantity of at least the volume of the data. That was obvious to me that was being served up. And so it's just a practical example of why localized search, while it's fantastic for consumers and really increases the relevancy of the content that they see, and it helps these platforms sell advertising dollars as well, it doesn't do a lot in terms of making your job any less complicated. So, again, I think a localized approach to this problem is almost required at this point if you really want to see what a consumer sees in that particular market. I had also mentioned understanding how the content is served up. And this is another practical example of running a scan across eBay, looking at all the listings that are there, and then within our system at least, we have built the capability to then correlate that information back and understand what we call the placement and the ranking of the content. So when someone types in XYZ brand to eBay, we know what content's being served up locally on that platform, and then we know which listing, in this case, appears in the upper left-hand corner and is the very first piece of content that well-intentioned consumer would see. And this enables the review and the enforcement process to have a much more appropriate starting point. We want to start at the tip of the iceberg and work our way backwards, starting with the most visible content and again, working in reverse. And that ensures that if that approach is taken on a consistent basis, we're constantly triaging and cleaning the areas that consumers are interacting with us. This is just an example of threat level analysis. And again, this is not technology that's new. Machine learning now has been around for quite a while. We use a lot of data science in the products that we build. And we also have a very large services organization
that is constantly trying to create efficiencies and ways to review content faster. And so the threat level analysis capability, at least that we took, or the approach that we took, is really based on human decision making. So as you're making decisions inside the system and you're flagging content for enforcement, the system obviously takes note. And over time, we'll begin to learn the type of content that you view as infringing. And it'll begin to color code and prioritize and help us bubble up that content to the surface for review and action potentially. There's a lot of different ways, again, to approach this. And behind the technology is a very basic methodology. And that methodology boils down to sort of how we used to do it, when we originally started, was really sitting with customers and understanding what are the elements that worry you the most, and what are some basic thresholds we want to put in place to understand the type of infringement you're comfortable pursuing. Because again, with the quantity of content that exists out there, it's important to have an approach, a methodology. I know that when I go to places like Amazon, one of the things that I really enjoy about buying products from there is the quantity of sorting and filtering capabilities that exist. It really makes purchasing from Amazon much more enjoyable when I can filter my results based on, for instance, the seller's feedback rating, or the cost of shipping, or the length of shipping. It's very granular and quite detailed. And so one of the things that we discovered in sort of monitoring Amazon for years and trying to help our customers protect, their brands, is that we needed a way to leverage all of those sorting and filtering capabilities. Because again, if we think about the consumer-centric approach, they don't go to Amazon, well-intentioned consumers that is, and typically do sort of a one keyword search and then buy the first product that they see. That just doesn't normally happen on Amazon. What happens is you start with a product search at the top, and then you will oftentimes spend quite a bit of time sorting and filtering and drilling down to the exact type of products that you're interested in, that not only provide the product, but also the elements of the experience that you want, as I described earlier. So we built a capability, at least into our platform, which allows us to externally go out to these platforms and in some cases initiate quite complex searches using dozens and dozens of different sorting and filtering permutations. So we can whittle our search down to very relevant products that we want and the sellers that we're interested in monitoring. And then we grab the URL, literally from the address bar of our browser. And then the analyst can put that URL into the MarkMonitor platform, and it will store all of those various meta fields and searching and filtering that the analyst just performed. And then we can go out and replicate that search as many times as we want to. So if I was building a program internally using, manual efforts, then this could easily be replicated from a detection standpoint, because we'd have people going out and actually initiating these types of searches. So for us, the lesson is that there has to be some way to account for how the consumer is finding the content on that particular platform, because it may be quite complex. And there has to be a way to take that into consideration in terms of how we go out and we look for the infringements that we care about. Some of the high-value targeting areas that we know are important to customers, and at least things that we've used in the past, typically also involve machine learning, again, as a big part of it. So it's important to not, sort of underestimate the importance of having powerful technology, because if you can approach this holistically, if you can store information in a database that can be mined and looked at, then clearly identifying patterns of abuse is going to be valuable, to the brand and to the enterprise. Our experience is that there is a percentage of sellers out there that and infringers for that matter, or fraudsters, if you will, that do present themselves as high-value targets in the sense that we can connect them to other activity. And that might be as simple as connecting a marketplace seller to a website, or someone that's initiating phishing attacks, connecting them to social media activity. Whenever connections like that can be made, there's a value potentially. And so the more connections, the higher the value. One of the things that we started doing was then comparing our online system with information that we could discover offline. And so if you're initiating things like test buys or physical investigations, any data like that can be used for high-value targeting, but clearly, some technology and expertise would be required to make it actionable. And therefore, our experience is most brands are not doing this on probably a consistent enough basis. But if there's a desire, to take it further and do so in situations where it's warranted and there's a return. A good example might be one of the things that we do for customers that are thinking about, civil litigation might be we perform really reports and deep dive investigations on individuals and entities because we're trying to understand what sort of assets they may be associated with, particularly in the United States. So that's just one practical example of how, your brand program online can extend offline and provide value from that respect. Partnerships and relationships absolutely matter, at least in our view. We've spent a lot of time investing in this portion of our ecosystem purely because, again, the internet is a symptom of a larger problem, and we really want to help our customers get finality whenever possible. And so I think, again, whether you're partnering with a vendor or you're going to have your own program internally, or you do, we would suggest that investing time in creating relationships in these areas will bear fruit. In some cases, we think it's significant, the benefit. So relationships with platforms matter, absolutely. Whether you're doing that yourself, lots of the brands that we work with, maintain relationships with platforms directly, especially ones that are mission critical to their business. And all that does is really aid and help and provide assistance. And we've invested a lot as a vendor anyway in having a lot of people and expertise that these various entities can interact with. And we would suggest that brand owners do the same. The level of that investment, of course, is up to you. But some level of investment we think is an absolute great idea and can prove indispensable at the right time. So just wrapping up, I wanted to share an actual example. And there's lots of them that I've experienced, in my 15, 16 years here, but I thought I would just call out one particular experience that I've seen and was a part of that I think helps accentuate why consumer-centric brand protection is important. And for obvious reasons, we're going to we've anonymized the data, but I'll certainly take you through, the story. And it is an apparel manufacturer, and they worked with, MarkMonitor from about June 2016 through May 2017, and we did a variety of things together. But in one particular area, marketplace sellers and really monitoring and infringing that landscape, we had a lot of success. Over that time period, as you can see, the quantity, and we're scanning the same quantity of data essentially every day over this time period and reviewing it, but clearly the quantity of infringements decreased significantly. And so the problem was at least getting smaller and appeared to be getting smaller. That customer went through a variety of changes and discontinued their program and changed ownership, and lots of different things happened and changed. But for a variety of reasons, they left and they stopped the approach. And in essence, as I mentioned earlier, that it's like a balloon, and it absolutely pops back up. And so vigilance is important in this game because it's what maintains the deterrent factor, right? If we start taking down content that infringes, that doesn't go unnoticed by the infringers themselves. And if you do that enough, you begin to really change the dynamic over time. And so if you take your foot off the gas, then of course the opposite happens. And so when we went out and did more scans and looked, the problem had absolutely resurfaced, unfortunately, less than about a year later. Many of the same sellers had returned, which we had seen previously. And it accentuates the fact that, at least from our perspective, programs with, ROI based on takedown volume alone, again, really doesn't improve the customer experience. So when this is another practical example. So we've got, a platform like iOffer, fairly popular platform, also highly compliant with our enforcements and cooperation with MarkMonitor, and I think pretty much everyone for the most part. And, the consumer-centric approach that we were taking inevitably yielded us about less than 10 infringements per day that were detected and removed. And within a year, it was essentially 97% infringements based on the study that we performed. So it's sort of imperative that I think when you're having success and things are moving in the right direction, which we think is a result of this consumer-centric approach, by the way. I mean, I really want to kind of emphasize that this is not unique and to MarkMonitor. I think anyone can take a consumer-centric approach to brand protection. And if you do that, I think the results are going to be better. I think consumers are going to interact with unauthorized content with much less frequency. I think the brand owners that I talk to on a consistent basis, that used to get emails every week from their colleagues and their superiors, pointing out Amazon listings and pointing out websites that had infringements, that decreases significantly. And it's not because there is no infringement. It's because we have laser focus on the areas where those colleagues and superiors and business partners are finding those examples. And so there are simply less of them available, which is a good thing, from our perspective. So to sort of recap a lot of what I've went through, and again, a lot of which we think is a foundation for any program. And I'm happy to kind of work with anyone or talk to anyone. I feel very evangelically, about these topics. And whether you work with us or someone else or no one at all, we think that the foundations for a successful program really kind of boil down to three big areas. One being the technology that we use, which can be a local search by a person at a computer, but we need the ability to emulate the consumer-centric approach and got to think about the relevance of this geographically. If I have a global brand, I need a global solution that can emulate and see what consumers and individuals see within those markets. Otherwise, we just don't really know. I didn't talk a lot about things like image matching and clustering, but it is technology that we rely on heavily. So I would just say that that's a must-have for any program that you use. If you're going to search the internet from an automated perspective and you want to have success with enforcement, one of the primary catalysts for takedown is the usage of imagery and copyrighted material. So some sort of technology and capability there is kind of a must-have from our perspective. And then I think it's really about how you report the program. Decide on the areas that matter, and then once your program is actually up and running, communicating that effectively upwards and laterally within your organization so people understand what we're spending money on, why we need the program, and whether or not it's successful. And I still believe there's a place at the table for an economic ROI discussion. I really do. I mean, I believe strongly that if we remove a lot of bad content, we're going to sell more authentic product, or we're going to have more online consumers on our website rather than another website. But I also believe that that's very difficult to measure. And in most cases, our customers haven't done it very successfully. So one additional approach might be to measure the level of infringement that's occurring on these platforms and then watch it get smaller. And then the smaller it becomes, the better the consumer experience. And that's usually a message, when delivered, I think, correctly, high-level executives seem to truly understand. I hope the program would be comprehensive. And you don't have to search everywhere on the internet. I mean, I think a lot of thought needs to go into which areas matter the most to the business from sort of a intellectual property standpoint, and then also from a marketing perspective, because if you're investing in those areas of the internet to generate revenue, we should be protecting them. But I do think there are limits to how broad you can go, and understanding that's important. But it may be as tactical as understanding, websites and social media and marketplaces, or perhaps the email channel if social engineering is what's troubling us. So boiling it down to threat vectors and then ensuring I have some sort of capability within each to understand, again, the tip of the iceberg, where consumers meet the content. I think having integration with external platforms is pretty key. And some sort of ability to bridge offline and online activity. Because again, I mean, I think online brand protection, we are treating the symptom of a larger problem. And we want to bring some finality in cases where we can and where it's feasible. And so the ability to bridge the gap between those two areas really does, I think, make for a more successful long-term program. And then expertise. There are certain elements of this, I think, that really do require deep-level expertise, certainly China being one area. We've had to invest a very large amount of money over the last decade in our Shanghai office to build out a very large team of experts. But once we did that, we dramatically saw an increase in the level of cooperation and compliance that we got from third parties, especially in cases where those platforms are very regionally based. And don't necessarily have a global perspective. You really need to be local. And then I think really partnerships. So spending the time to perhaps go to some conferences, using the opportunity to network with law enforcement, and of course platforms themselves. And there's a lot of venues to do that now that are available to pretty much any brand owner. And so and I can tell you that those organizations are also very receptive from hearing from brands directly. So to the extent that you have the resource and the wherewithal, you'll find them to be quite receptive. So one area that we've helped customers is really creating introductions and relationships where they don't exist. And we're happy to do that and help be a middleman in those cases. But we encourage all brand owners to do that, on their own as well. So just some key takeaways. Without a doubt, online shopping is increased in complexity. And, not only that, everything is becoming e-commerce now. Social media platforms now have e-commerce capabilities integrated directly with them. So this trend is going to continue. It's going to get more difficult to point to one area in particular and say, this is where my consumer interacts with me, because they're going to do it everywhere. So that is creating, I think, significant confusion and complexity that's important to understand. And again, historically, I think the success of a brand protection program has been incorrectly measured by activity. Detecting and removing a listing is an activity. And I think activity is important. We want to see a lot of activity, of course, within our solution and our efforts every day. But again, I don't know of a brand owner who feels like the quantity of activity has really been the driving force to any level of success they've had with their program, because it's really about that consumer experience. So we have found that we do believe ROI is attainable here. But again, it requires shifting the focus to the well-intentioned consumer and really designing our program from that perspective. That level of success really does require some technology and expertise. But we think those tools are available in the market, again, in a variety of different places. There's a lot of expertise available. We're happy to provide information to anyone, customer or not, who's interested in ways of getting more involved in some of those events. And so we think those things are really mission critical. Thank you all for your time today. I really appreciated the opportunity to go through this content with you. As I mentioned, I believe strongly whether you're building a program yourself internally with a team of people or you're going to rely on a patchwork of vendors or solution providers, we believe that some of these elements are really important to keep in mind. And if we can do anything to help anyone, we're happy to do it. So thank you so much for your time. And back to you, Akino.
Thank you, David, for a great presentation. As promised, we'll take the next 10 minutes to answer any questions you guys might have. If you have questions for our presenter, please type them into the Q&A or chat window available in the bottom of the WebEx platform. Also, please be reminded, if we don't get to your question during today's Q&A session, we'll be sure to follow up afterwards. Our first question, Dave, is, do you think the consumer-centric approach works for services companies too? If so, how?
Thanks, Akino. Yeah, I do believe whether you're in a services-related business or you're selling a consumer product, I think the same methodology applies because there are people who engage the internet through mobile, through desktop, through other methods, and when they type in your brand, they're looking for you. And that doesn't change whether you're a services company or travel and hospitality related or physical products. And so I think if the same methodology is applied, again, starting with the consumer-centric vision, the consumer-centric approach, seeing it through their eyes. Now, where we do that may be different, right? Obviously, if I'm in a services-related business, I'm a lot less concerned with something like Amazon, but I may be highly concerned with search engines and organic placement and what the consumer sees when they type my brand into Google or to Facebook for that matter. So same methodology applies irrespective of the industry.
Thank you. Another question is, what are some of the ways that MarkMonitor is able to determine whether listings are counterfeit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is we don't make that determination, at least in probably, I would say, more than 90% of the cases. And what I mean is we identify content when we're doing physical products where the likelihood that that content represents an authentic product or an authorized seller for that matter is so remote that we are compelled to review it, most likely action it. We do a lot of test buys with customers. So if you truly want to know if a product is counterfeit, in our view, you must purchase it. You must examine it. You must see it. Now, we do work with a lot of customers, and we analyze their existing catalog of authorized products, and through deductive reasoning, we can calculate that we might believe something to be counterfeit. Now, just because we believe that, and our client, the brand owner, believes that, doesn't necessarily mean the enforcement we'll initiate will be calling that person a counterfeiter. I haven't bought the product. How can I call it a counterfeit? But perhaps it's, a pair of shoes, and they're in a color that I know that the customer does not manufacture. Well, through that reasoning, we know, well, this is a high likelihood of being a counterfeit, but I haven't purchased it. So in those cases, almost always, we would take an IP-related infringement pathway because, as I mentioned before, I may be committing counterfeiting, but I'm almost always simultaneously violating some other intellectual property right that you have. So we don't have to call someone a counterfeiter just because we believe that they are. What we have to do is find the path of least resistance to removing the content, because that is our number one objective. I hope that answers the question, because it's one I get quite frequently, and I understand, its origin. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Coop. One last question for you. What are tips to come up with good quality keyword searches? So I guess the question is, like, any tips that you could give to the audience in terms of how we could have quality keyword searches?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think there's a couple of different approaches that I would mention. I think there are some platforms where true understanding of that data is not publicly available. So, for instance, platforms which are not supported by advertising, they typically will not make that sort of information available. So in those cases, I think your next best approach would be using something like Google Analytics. Using something like Google Analytics, yourself, your counsel, your vendor, your team can quite easily develop a list of the most commonly used keywords and how they associate with your brand. And then I would use those as my starting point in terms of the scans that I'm performing, on platforms that are not ad supported. And because I do believe that in cases where there are platforms that are supported by advertising, that data is most likely available. And all you probably need to do is ask them for it, because that data is used by them to encourage additional purchasing of ad space. So that's what I would say is those are the two primary methods. But a good place to start is simply by using Google Analytics, because there are very few companies on earth, in my view, that are better at understanding human search behavior than Google. And I think if you start with their free analytics tool, you can absolutely come up with a great starting point for the keywords you should use within your scan.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar today, Building an Unrivaled Brand Protection Strategy. Please take a few minutes to complete our brief survey, which will automatically appear as you exit today's webinar. Hope everyone has a great day.